House Energy Policy Committee will come to order. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chair. Here. Representative Howe. Here. I'm sorry. Here. Barrett. Okay. Oh, here. Cole. Here. Tedder. Here. Molino. Here. Farrington.
Here.
Griffin.
Here.
Johnson. Here. LaFave.
Here.
Lauer.
Here.
Riley. Here. Lazinski.
Here.
Diana.
Here.
Keebler. Garrett. Camilleri.
Here.
Elder.
Here.
Green. Here. Mr. Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. I need a motion to approve minutes for the meeting 3 weeks ago. Representative LaFave makes the motion without objection, so ordered. We are privileged today to have Jerry Norcia. Is that correct, Jerry? Jerry Norcia from Detroit Edison is going to take up our full 90 minutes this morning. And Jerry, as I indicated the other night, if you would, looks like your presentation's about 10 minutes. And then members of the committee, you'll then have, 80 minutes remaining. So squeeze every drop of information out of him you can. Get as many of your questions answered as you can. And I have... Representative Barrett did time at Guantanamo, Jerry, so be on your best behavior. If you would, come on up and let's get started. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Chairman Glenn, Vice Chair Houck, Vice Chair Lazinski, and members of the House Energy Policy Committee. My name is Jerry Norcia. Thank you for providing the opportunity to come before you to talk about our company. DTE Energy has been in business since 1849, and our employees and our assets, such as power plants, pipelines, and wires, have provided fundamental services during the growth of our state into an industrial powerhouse. As an employee at this company, I have the privilege to be part of a team of 10,000 employees and over 1,600 Michigan-based suppliers that all come to work every day with a passion to serve Michigan. It is an honor. We truly believe that Michigan's success is our success. My goal today is to share a bit about who we are as an organization, our operations here in Michigan and across the country, and what we aim to accomplish in the future to secure a reliable and affordable energy future for Michigan's families and businesses. DTE Energy is Michigan's largest utility with over 3.5 million customers throughout the state. Our 10,000 employees represent one of the most engaged workforces in the country. In fact, DTE Energy is a 4-time winner of the Gallup Great Place Workplace Award, an honor which recognizes organizations that make employee engagement a fundamental foundation of their business. We remain the only utility to ever win this award. Our employees' pride and passion for the work they do demonstrates their commitment to DTE Energy's aspiration to become a force for growth and prosperity in the communities where we live and serve, and the best operated energy utility in America. DTE Energy has a broad impact in communities throughout the state. We're Michigan's largest taxpayers, contributing more than $320 million in 2016 alone. Additionally, DTE Energy is a proud participant in the Pure Michigan Business Connect program. Our robust supplier network includes 1,600 Michigan-based companies across 64 counties in the state. We have invested $5.9 billion in Michigan since 2010, supporting over 13,000 jobs across the upper and lower peninsulas. As we look out at the infrastructure investments we must make, DTE Energy will continue this in-state supplier investment, projecting a commitment of $5 billion over the next 5 years. When you hear the words DTE Energy, most people think of their electric or gas utilities. While our two utilities comprise the largest part of our company, you may be surprised to know that DTE Energy also operates a variety of energy services in 19 states. This widespread operation means that we have had the opportunity to compete on costs and services in all types of regulatory structures. The electricity energy systems, whether it is the fuel that runs through our vehicles, the electricity that powers our factories, or the natural gas that heats our homes, are the arteries that power our economy and maintain our quality of life. Because they are so vital to all that we do, all aspects of energy services are subject to regulatory oversight to ensure safety, consumer protection, and affordability. Like the majority of utilities in the U.S., DTE Energy's electric and gas services are regulated by state agencies to ensure that Michigan's families and businesses have reliable access to affordable energy. You're most likely familiar with DTE Electric, which provides electric service to 2.2 million customers in southeast Michigan. DTE Electric has served the needs of the state since 1886. during which time we powered Henry Ford's original factories and the birth of the automobile industry, the booming rise of Detroit, the Great Recession, and Southeast Michigan's recovering industrial strength. Following massive investments in the country's infrastructure after World War II, residents of the United States have benefited from electric service that sets the worldwide standard for electric reliability. The bridges, highways, water systems, and power plants built in the 40s and 50s propelled our economy at a critical growth period in our country's history. Today, the country is grappling with the need to reinvest in decades-old infrastructure, including energy generation, and strengthen the critical systems we rely on every day. DTE Electric is actively meeting this once-in-a-generation challenge, and will retire over 3,000 megawatts of coal-fired generation over the next 15 years. We will replace it with natural gas and renewables, generating a reliable supply of cleaner energy for decades to come. This transition is important to both Michigan and DTE, since this energy infrastructure will power the industries of our state's economy, support thousands of jobs here at home, and ensure Michigan's success for generations to come. Beyond transforming the electric generation fleet, DTE Electric is also implementing a multi-year strategy to upgrade how we distribute electricity to our customers. We're investing in our infrastructure in a way that makes sense for our customers, bringing them more reliable power. We're adopting new technologies that will enable us to isolate outages from a control center without rolling trucks. We will utilize grid sensors that allow us to know the health of the electric system in real time, flag and correct equipment problems before an outage occurs, and learn more about outages instantaneously. DTE's investments in smart technologies and overall infrastructure upgrades have improved service quality, resulting in 70% more reliable power for customers in 2016 versus 2014. Modernizing our grid is creating a smarter, more reliable system that will be prepared for Michigan's energy needs today and into the future. DTE Gas, our gas utility, provides natural gas to 1.3 million customers across both the upper and lower peninsulas. Like DTE Electric, DTE Gas is undertaking infrastructure upgrade initiatives to improve reliability and safety for our customers. Just 6 years ago, we were implementing main and service line upgrades at a pace of 21 miles per year. Thanks to increased efficiency, investment, and expertise, DTE Gas will replace up to 140 miles of mostly cast iron or bare steel pipe this year with polyethylene plastic pipes. In addition, DTE Gas employees, this effort will rely on Michigan-based contractors, engineers, and restoration teams to complete the work, putting money into the local economy and driving job creation. Most importantly, it will ensure improved safety and service for our customers. As stated previously, DTE Energy also operates several non-utility services in addition to our statewide regulated utilities. These services are regulated by federal entities and operate both inside and outside of Michigan. DTE Gas Storage and Pipelines operates midstream natural gas assets such as storage facilities and interstate pipeline infrastructure. The work of this business is increasingly important as demand for natural gas in the U.S. rises. To meet this rising demand for natural gas and electric generation, our pipeline and storage business is investing in projects such as the 255-mile Nexus pipeline, which will connect Michigan to abundant and low-cost supplies of natural gas from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. Nexus will support over 1,500 jobs in Michigan and $2 billion of capital investment and increased tax base in Michigan and Ohio. Most importantly, increased access to natural gas markets will help to prevent price increases as natural gas power plants are built and gas demand rises here in Michigan. In fact, Nexus will save gas and electric customers around $3.1 billion over the next 20 years. DTE Power and Industrial and DTE Energy Trading provide a host of energy services to both manufacturers and energy providers. These services include on-site energy generation for large commercial and industrial customers, environmental protection controls, and energy sourcing and management solutions. One such project is an 8-megawatt on-site generating facility for a manufacturing company in Ohio. It is built and in service under a bilateral contract to support the power needs of the manufacturing facility. In all that we do, DTE Energy takes seriously its aspiration to become the best operated energy company in North America. DTE Energy has become an industry leader in controlling operation and maintenance costs. From 2008 to 2015, our electric industry peers increased their operating and maintenance costs by an average of 34%, while DTE Energy actually reduced its operating maintenance costs by 3%. This dedication to controlling operating and maintenance costs translates to real savings for our customers. In the last 3 years, DTE's electric industrial rates have fallen 5.5% on average, while the Great Lakes average increased 0.9%. For residential customers, a better indicator of affordability is customer bills rather than rates. DTE's electric and residential bills are 6% below the national average. Our commitment to quality and service has also translated into an increasingly safe work environment for our employees. In fact, 2016 was DTE Energy's safest year in the history of our company. You can assess the quality of a company's leadership, its employees, and operating practice by its employees' safety record. I'm proud to say that we have one of the best employee safety records in the industry. Our emphasis on quality service has also resulted in higher customer satisfaction. In 2016, we placed second among our Midwest peers in the J.D. Power's residential customer satisfaction in both gas and electric service. Electric reliability and affordability are front and center for families and businesses. It is for us too. We will continue our commitment to operational excellence and affordability, especially in the coming years as Michigan transforms its electricity generation fleet. We understand that there is a desire to study electric market regulation and consider whether or not Michigan should shift from state to federal market regulation or fully deregulate. In the 90s, in states where electricity prices were among the highest, the movement towards deregulation emerged in search of lower cost, more reliable power supply, and customer satisfaction. After 2 decades of experience, transferring decision-making authority from state to federal regulators has not delivered on any of these promises. On average, rates in deregulated states are 25% higher than in regulated states, and they have never been lower. Federally regulated markets in states like Illinois, New York, and Ohio have sought or are seeking state-mandated bailouts for baseload power plants that are critical for reliability. There is a movement in these states back towards state regulation. Last year, J.D. Power residential customer satisfaction in federally regulated states ranked in the bottom of their class. State-regulated states averaged in the top third. In the midst of both an economic comeback and an energy generation transformation, Michigan should look ahead at a bright future, not over our shoulder at deeply flawed markets and federal regulation. DTE Energy's commitment to Michigan and the people of the state is deeply rooted in our 170-year history. Michigan's success is DTE's success by the nature of our business, our responsibility to our employees, and our commitment to be a force for growth within the communities where we live and serve. Going forward, we will continue to embody this commitment as we lead Michigan into the next era of its energy future. This is an introduction to our company, but I hope this opens up additional opportunities in the future for the committee to learn more about the energy industry, our company, and how DTE Energy powers our state. I welcome a discussion regarding any questions you may have about my testimony or other aspects of DTE Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Morcia. Committee questions? Representative Houck, Vice Chair Houck.
Yeah, as you noted, I toured your coal plant down in Monroe yesterday, and I was riding back with Jim, and we were talking about the plant that you and consumers have together in Ludington. And then we were, about how you pump the water up during the night because of the electricity is cheaper, and then you let it out during the day when you need more power. And then we started talking about batteries, and I was just wondering where DTE is going with batteries. And I know that if you think about the first cell phone we had, it was a big bag, and now the battery technology has kept on getting better and better and better. And I was just wondering if you were doing any research or if you what's going on with that.
So I think thank you for the question, Vice Chair. We are experimenting with chemical batteries on a small scale, and but I'm glad you brought up Ludington, because that is like a big battery. That is a large storage of energy that happens that then is pumped up during the day, so it's recharging the battery during the day when you pump the water into the man-made lake, and then you let it flow out of the lake during the day when you need the power. So it really acts like a big battery, but it's a non-chemical battery. And I was up there several weeks ago, and it's a very impressive facility. We were spending over $1 billion there to upgrade all the turbines. So that does provide battery service. But chemical batteries, I think technology needs to really move along fundamentally in order for it to make a difference economically. It's still very expensive to use chemical batteries as a source of storage in our industry. But again, if you look at some of our renewable resources, they also started out quite expensive, and some of those costs have come down by at least 50%. So we are encouraged by the amount of investment and research that's happening in batteries, but we don't see wide-scale adoption just yet, purely because of economics. But that may change in the future. So we are working with it, experimenting with it. So we'll see what time brings and American ingenuity brings.
Jerry, I got a question, and this is one of the challenging things about this issue is the totally opposite sources of information we get, and you and I have discussed this.
Yes.
The Cleveland State and Ohio State did a study released just in the last 6 months, I think it was, that indicated that Ohio ratepayers had saved $15 billion, I think they calculated, directly attributable to the totally open electricity choice market in Ohio. I think we're now up to, according to media reports, 10 new plants being built in Ohio. And so they not only have cheaper electricity, but in terms of any kind of capacity questions, apparently they're doing something that stimulates growth more than we're doing here in Michigan. And the COMPETE study says that the rate increases in what I call the free market states since 2008, so in the last 10 years, have been half as much as in the monopoly states. For members of the committee, a regulated state I call a monopoly state, and a deregulated state I refer to as a free market state. So it appears in those choice states that rates are going up not as much as in the monopoly states, and fairly well respected academic sources indicate there have been some substantial $15 billion. So I know you do business in Ohio, so would you provide some commentary on that?
Sure. So what I would say is that if you look at, we have an appendix here, and I think slide 1 would show you, in green shows the states that are regulated, and then the other colors, red and green and hatched, are basically the states that have attempted deregulation. And basically 70% of the states today remain deregulated. And I'll get to Ohio, but I think a little bit of context will hopefully be helpful. When the states that attempted deregulation, and it was a genuine effort to deregulate these markets, because I think America is built on a cornerstone of competition and free market enterprise. So I think in those states where they attempted deregulation, they had very, very high rates and very high utility costs. You might say, well, why is that? Well, it was really for two reasons. The states on the East Coast and West Coast were the furthest from the resource that was used to basically generate power. At that time, it was coal or it was oil, and then eventually it became natural gas. So if you think about New York, Connecticut, and New England, which where most of the deregulated states reside, or the attempted deregulation started, they were the furthest away from the pipelines. They were the furthest away from the coal mines. So it was, and they were northern states, which meant they used less electricity, which drove their rates up. So the legislators there and the regulators really made a concerted effort to try and deregulate. Now, what they found when they tried to deregulate is that deregulation means, like if you're like Ford Motor Company, you build cars when you want, you sell cars at whatever price you want. And so these deregulated entities said, well, I'll produce power when I want to produce power, and I'll charge whatever price I want. And I think what legislators and regulators found is that that's unacceptable in our industry. So they quickly stepped in and started to re-regulate. But since the states had vacated from regulation, the only alternative was for the federal government to step in and start regulating these markets. So they started creating rules. So one of the first rules they created is you must run your plant when we tell you to run it. And it doesn't matter whether you make money or not, you're going to run your plant because we need it to support the grid. It's a fundamental and essential service. The next thing they did is they started capping prices, because any time prices ran up, they said, well, geez, we can't have consumers paying these high prices for electricity, so they put caps on pricing. So so now I'll work back to Ohio. So really what you ended up with is a document this big. This is the PGM, which is the market that Ohio operates in. This is the pricing manual that the federal government created in what we call, or what people try to call, a free market. And it's a very complicated document. So what's happened in Ohio is that there's been a big move afoot to try and re-regulate because the power plants can't function in this environment and recover their fixed costs and variable costs and actually keep the plants running. And I think your point about that there's been a lot of savings, if you look to slide 4 in the appendix, which is the industrial rates in Ohio, what you'll find is that the industrial rates in Ohio are actually higher than the industrial rates in Michigan and those charged by DTE Energy. So I think the premise, and we'll have to look at the numbers that you provided, and love to do more analysis on that, but I think even on slide 2, which really was in my testimony, you'll see that deregulated states back in 2000, when people started experimenting with deregulation, which eventually became federal regulation, the rates were higher then and they're higher today. And our source of information is the environmental, or the federal agency that works under DOE called EIA. This is information that's readily available, but I think you'll find that if you look at that information, the rates were higher then and they're higher today in non-regulated states. And they're about 25% higher today.
Jerry, again, this is one of the most frustrating things about this issue because other sources will cite EIA in portraying Michigan's rates as the highest in the Midwest and about 12th highest in the nation. And your graph cites EIA as indicating something to the contrary, which is a great source of frustration for me, having been at this now for 2 years. And we'll get you a copy of that Ohio State study. Have a question from Representative Lefebvre.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize for saying I wasn't going to ask a question because I lied. I'm looking at page 4, and I can almost guarantee it's not any purposeful omission. I don't see the state of Wisconsin on page 4, and I only noticed that because I was looking for it because that's where I get my power.
Wisconsin. I don't see it on there either, but we can get you that.
Thank you, sir.
Be happy to get you that. Thank you.
Representative Camilleri.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation today. So I know there's been a lot of discussion around retirement of coal plants, including one in my district in Trenton Channel. So I was wondering if you could walk us through the timeline of those retirements and what the thought process is going forward in terms of how the portfolio will be changing.
Sure. So we'll be retiring some of our coal plants. The plants that won't be retiring in the next 10 years will be our Bell River Power Plant and our Monroe Power Plant coal fleet, as well as Fermi, which is our nuclear plant. Many of our other plants, as you mentioned, like Trenton, Rouge, as well as our St. Clair power plants, will likely retire in the next 10 years. So by 2022, 2023, we'll be deep into the process of retiring those plants. They are baseload generating plants, so we will need to replace those with baseload generating plants, such as natural gas, and they'll also be complemented by wind and solar.
So, Representative Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning.
Good morning.
My question revolves around renewables, and you touched on it a bit in some of your testimony this morning. The cost of renewables continues to decline. Now it's significantly cheaper than coal in some areas, even natural gas. I would think increasing renewables would be a position DTE would want to promote. Is DTE planning on going above the minimum 15% renewable energy standard and the 1% energy efficiency standard adopted last year? If not, then why not?
So we definitely will meet the requirements. Our intention is to continue to invest in renewables, and what we have found is that the cost of renewables continues to come down. And as we run our models, renewables will fit more and more into our portfolio as economics dictate. You know, we're trying to balance environmental goals with affordability for our customers. And as we balance those goals, we do definitely see more renewables in our future. Now, the costs have come way down, but there's a difference in the resource. You know, the wind and solar resources have come down on a per unit cost basis, but the fundamental difference is that they're not dispatchable. So one of the things we have to rely on is dispatchable energy. In other words, when we need the power, it has to be there. So it is a balance, and we'll continue to build that portfolio while maintaining a balance of environmental society's desire for more environmental measures to be taken and more renewables to come into place, as well as affordability.
Jerry, can you describe to the committee the difference between rates and bills?
Yeah, that's a good question. Basically, rates are what you pay per kilowatt hour. Bills is the total bill, that cash that comes out of your pocket. So what determines rates is the cost for the facility, say for wires and poles, and what it costs to invest as well as maintain those assets. That cost is divided by the volume that you put through those wires. So the more volume that you put through those wires, the lower your rates. The more volume you put through those wires, the higher your bills. So they're kind of inversely related, if that makes sense to you.
So the rate is what's would be the cost of generating the the cost of the electricity, and the bill would then include other things other than the cost of electricity.
No, actually not necessarily. So the rate is a cost per kilowatt hour. So it's the cost that it takes to produce and deliver the energy on a per kilowatt hour basis. The total cost, your bill, is really how much you pay every month. It's your DTE bill that comes in the mail every month. What's the total amount? That's the total cost. That's the total bill.
I got another question about Ohio. My information is that DTE has won the right to be the provider of last resort in some sort of auction mechanism in Ohio.
We do provide wholesale services in Ohio, so we sell to the utilities in Ohio. We do not sell in the retail markets.
And do you charge higher or lower rates in Ohio than you charge Michigan customers?
I don't know what we charge, but it is a competitive process where we do compete for the wholesale energy services in Ohio. So we're buying assets and lining up assets for the LDC markets there, for the distribution markets.
So would you support changing Michigan's energy policy to mirror that of Ohio in that regard, in terms of who is the provider of last resort? Over the last 2 years, there was that was often cited as one of the reasons that you were opposed to electricity choice, is because DTE in your market area is required to be the provider of last resort. I think Illinois and apparently also Ohio put that out to bid. Who's going to be the provider of last resort? So would you support a similar setup here in Michigan?
I think what we're supportive of is the legislation that just got completed in Michigan, where we have a highly regulated model with a compromise around choice, the alternative energy suppliers, where they have to bring assets to bear to support that market. Again, to distinguish Ohio, Ohio tried to experiment with deregulation, and it's our assessment that deregulation has been a failure. And it's a failure because you've got the power generators now seeking state re-regulation, just like they are in Illinois. It's been a failed experiment in Illinois. It's a failed experiment in Ohio, where these assets are desiring to be state regulated again because the federal rules and the federal mandates around competition are not working. As a matter of fact, the Chairman LaFleur of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, was just in Texas, where there's regulation and deregulation that coexist. And she has basically stated that federally regulated markets like in Ohio and Illinois and Texas are not working. And the reason they're not working is because these power plants can't recover their fixed costs and variable costs and survive. And so then you start to impact the reliability of generation in those states. So it's very interesting. I think it was a real genuine effort to try and lower rates by introducing federal rules, but it has not worked. It has not produced lower prices.
I am compelled to offer some commentary on that, to put a little different spin on it. It's my understanding that the only entities in Ohio that are seeking re-regulation are the large utility, one in particular, that apparently found it could not compete. And obviously there are different definitions of whether or not free markets in Ohio have succeeded or not, when Ohio State and Cleveland State say that ratepayers have saved $15 billion in the last 5 years, and they have 10 plants being built, which is, I believe, 10 more than are being built in Michigan in terms of the reliability and the capacity, all that new generation capacity in Ohio. So by those standards, I have to judge that there's been some success. And I talked to a state senator in Ohio. He said there's no way they're going back. He said it's just not going to happen. And given the results, the savings for ratepayers, if you're looking at it from the ratepayer perspective, seems pretty successful.
Well, you know, in Ohio, the government stepped in several times to freeze rates. So the state government in between 2001 and 2006 actually imposed a rate freeze on rates, which kind of defies free market principles. And then from 06 to 09, they introduced another rate stabilization period where they actually capped rates and manipulated rates for the power generators in Ohio. So there's a lot of, you know, government interference in those markets. Like I said, the pricing book for Ohio looks like this, and these are federal rules that govern pricing in Ohio. And if we're going to operate in a free market, then it has to be more like Ford Motor Company. No regulation on prices, no must-run provisions. Those are just fundamentals in free market economics that if you have to compete with your hands tied behind your back, it's pretty tough to do so.
I'll just simply ask you if you think it's fair or unfair to say that DTE competes in a competitive market in Ohio and opposes the same type of competition in Michigan.
So I'll tell you our history in Ohio. We were in the retail markets in Ohio, and because we're such a firm believer that the retail markets in Ohio and in other states are so dysfunctional, we removed ourselves from those markets and resorted to supplying the distribution companies, the load-serving entities like DTE Energy that are out in the market trying to buy capacity to serve their customers. So that's the product that we deliver in Ohio, and yes, we provide that on a competitive basis based on the assets that are available. But we do not participate in the retail markets, which is where all of the dysfunction exists.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. Representative Bellino?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Jerry. Got a couple questions, please. In my district, the 17th district, we have a couple of nice-sized solar arrays. The IHM Nuns have one. My college in Monroe has a nice, large solar array. And when I look across the water from All Gray, I see a huge field of windmills in the thumb. Is it safe to say that federal and state mandates have pushed us to get more involved in renewables? And how much have we invested in renewables the last 10 years or so?
So here in the state of Michigan, I'll speak for DTE Energy, there has been state mandates that have driven investment in renewable energy, and DTE Energy has invested $1 billion directly, and our partners have invested another $1 billion, primarily in wind energy. We are also investing in solar energy. We're in Lapeer County, we've got a 50 megawatt facility, which is the largest solar array east of the Mississippi. We're happy to say that we're seeing fundamental reductions in the cost of wind energy as well as solar energy. I mean, when we started investing in wind, we were well over $100 per megawatt hour, and that cost now is down as low as, in some areas of Huron County, $30 a megawatt hour, which is very competitive.
Thank you. A couple more questions, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe.
At the Fermi plant, or at the coal burner in Monroe, we have a huge new building in the back that we built in the last 5 years to clean up the exhaust. ERC it's called, or I know what it's called, but
DSR, yes.
Okay, how much did we invest in that building in the back?
That's that whole facility there at Monroe is about a $2 billion investment, and what I'm really proud of at Monroe is that we invested to remove nitrous oxides and sulfur dioxides and mercury, and those are some of the agents that cause acid rain, and I'm happy to say that the removal rate is incredible, and about the only thing coming out of that stack now is steam and carbon dioxide.
Thank you. I appreciate it living near the plant, and Canada appreciates it too. And a couple more questions. My wife called me 3 weeks ago now and said, we have no power, but I got online. They've dispatched from Newport, be fixed in 4 hours. Could they know that quick we were out of power because we have a smart meter in our house? Is that how they know we're out of power that quick?
Well, that's one of our first indications that power has been lost is from our smart meters, because they feed that information into our control center every 15 minutes. We know whether the power is on or off, and it's been extremely helpful in terms of diagnosing where we're having power outages and also to dispatch our crews.
The newer typical gas-fired plants, where they don't have a boiler, do they typically have a lot less employees than a coal burner?
Yes, they do. So, for example, a 1,000 megawatt coal plant may need 600 employees. A 1,000 megawatt gas plant usually requires about 30 employees.
Wow.
And the big difference is the fuel supply. If you think about coal plants, you need people with dozers and loaders to move big coal piles around. You also need rail coming in, and rail mechanizations that help unload the coal and deliver the coal mills. There's a huge fuel supply component to the workforce at a coal plant. In a gas plant, it's basically a pipeline that delivers into the combustion chamber of the turbine, and that's about it. So that's why it's so low in terms of labor intensity.
It's like automation in a car plant.
Correct. Now, the good news is that we've got a significant amount of attrition at DTE Energy over the next 10 to 15 years, where about 50% of our workforce will retire. So our goal is that, as a company, we've been very public that we're not a believer in layoffs. That would be a very, very last resort, and we really value our employees. So as employees retire, we will likely not replace them with permanent employees in anticipation of these coal retirements.
And I think that's it, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Representative. Representative Farrington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Jerry, for being here today.
Thank you.
Michigan law prohibits your company from making a profit on the sale of natural gas. Is that correct?
Can you please repeat the question?
Michigan law prohibits your company from making a profit on the sale of natural gas. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The Michigan Public Service Commission approves a gas cost recovery rate to make sure the utility is charging the exact same amount it paid for the gas. So it is my understanding that profits are made through the customer service and distribution charge included in a typical natural gas bill. Can you describe how these charges are calculated and if they are subject to approval by the Public Service Commission?
So it's correct that we do not make a profit on the natural gas commodity itself. Whatever we purchase it for and pay to have it delivered to Michigan, that's the cost that we pass on to our customers. And that's regulated and scrutinized by the Michigan Public Service Commission. Even though we don't make a profit on it, they want to make sure that we make the best possible purchases and that our purchasing strategy is prudent for our customers and reasonable for our customers. In addition to that, where we do make our profits is in the delivery of the products through our pipelines. So how is that calculated? Well, that's a cost of service calculation, again, highly regulated and scrutinized by the Michigan Public Service Commission. And it's based on the amount of dollars that we have invested in our gas infrastructure, plus our operating costs, plus depreciation expense, plus a reasonable return. That's how the rates are set.
Thank you.
Jerry, I got a few more questions for you. The narrative over the last 2 years, including about $2 million worth of television ads, was that Michigan was facing an impending crisis in energy capacity. We were going to have shortfalls, which I believe the public interpreted to mean shortage when it really meant nothing comparable to an actual shortage of electricity. And one of the elements of proof that was offered that Michigan was facing this reduction in capacity was the MISO auction price went from $4 up to $73. So a scarcity of electricity supply, the argument went, resulted in that spike in the price of some, I think, 2,000%. And that was used as justification for continuing a cap on the 10% choice market. MISO just had an auction within the last couple of weeks, and now the price for a megawatt day went from $73 last year to $1.50 this year, which free market economics would suggest means there is now, instead of a shortage, a glut in electricity, and thus the price went dramatically down. Can you explain from your perspective what the price hike last year meant and what it means that it now came down even 2 or 3 times lower than where it was before 2 or 3 years ago?
So when I saw that result, I was very surprised myself, and so we started to do a little bit of research on what happened. How did the price move down when we're moving towards a shortage inside MISO and inside Michigan? I'll talk a little more about how I feel, or how our company feels about the resource adequacy. But the price, let me take that on. So as we did our research, what we found out is that, as you may be well aware, in Illinois, the state legislature passed a law to re-regulate the nuclear plants in Illinois, which feed into our zone, MISO zone. And when they did that, they set a price that these nuclear plants can charge through regulated rates to their customers. So when you offer assets that are regulated into MISO, the capacity value put on it is zero. And the reason you do that is because you're already recovering the value of that capacity through regulated rates through your state regulator. So if you were to charge something, you'd be charging twice, and then you'd have to give that money back. So our interpretation of what happened is that these now plants that were re-regulated by the state of Illinois offered their capacity at zero, and that drove the whole complex down. Now, we'll know more details on that in May when MISO releases actually the detailed bidding of each of the power plants. Like, so for example, when we offer our plants into the capacity auction, we offer them at zero because we're already recovering that in our regulated rates, so it would not be prudent to try and charge something that would double charge our customers. Then we'd have to turn around a year later and give it all back. I mean, that makes no sense. So what's happening, Chairman Glenn, is that the market is really trading to variable cost. So capacity is zero because that's being recovered somewhere else. So now MISO is almost completely regulated, other than some hybrid opportunities here in Michigan and other parts of MISO, but there's very little amount that really needs to trade in terms of capacity. So the only thing that's really selling in MISO is energy, which trades at the cost of fuel. So that's what's happened with prices. That's why the prices came down so fundamentally. So really what that means is that the capacity auction does not reflect what's really going on in the market. Now let me speak for ourselves here at DTE Energy, how we feel about resource adequacy. I can tell you that when we run our numbers, and you include our reserve margin, and I can talk about why reserve margin is necessary, but when we include our reserve margin, we don't have any excess supply. We should be worried as we continue to retire coal plants, and what we should be worried about is that the alternative energy suppliers don't have real assets that you can point to. And I want to thank all of you who went to Monroe, because those are real assets and they generate real power, and that's what we need in this state. You know, power doesn't arrive here by some kind of magic. We need real generating plants, real wires to transmit and produce that power. And my worry is, if we're completely balanced for the customers who pay us for generation, who's taking care of these customers that are on choice and EASs? You know, can they point to a power plant? Can they point to a contract? Now, the legislature addressed that in the law last year, and I'm happy that we did that. That's progress. But we are not sitting on a lot of excess generation here in the state of Michigan, and that's something that I hope you will all worry about as we do, so that we can invest in the future and make sure that we don't have a problem here.
Well, that continues to be a nagging question for me, because all I got to do is look across a state line to a state in Ohio where the rates are lower, and they're now, you know, last year when we were discussing it, it was 6 new power plants in the process of being built. Media reports now say it's up to 6. So in terms of capacity, Ohio is addressing that, while we've built no new plants here that I'm aware of, except for one of the AES's, Wolverine Power. And I think the last time one of our major utilities built a plant was in the 80s. But in Ohio, they've got 10 plants in the process being built. The rates are cheaper. How should this committee not conclude that their system is working better than ours?
Well, I think that in Ohio, the number of plants that have been retired actually exceed the number of new plants that have been built. I think that data is readily available as well. But in terms of rates, their residential rates are lower than ours. I think I showed you that our industrial rates are lower than they are in Ohio. Now, residential rates are lower in Ohio because they use a lot more electricity through the same wires and through the same infrastructure. Their bills are higher, so a residential bill in Ohio is greater than a residential bill in Michigan. That's just because of usage. So that's the distinction. But in terms of power plants being built in the state of Michigan, you'll remember when we went through the recession, You know, the reserve margin that you try to maintain on an electric grid is about 15%. And that's been established through 100 years of power generators and electric distributors, utilities operating assets across this country. 15% is there in the event that there's an upset in the system, that a power plant doesn't run because there's a failure or a problem with the power plant. So 15% keeps the grid reliable for an industrialized nation. So that's a given. So back during the recession, we were up around 25%, 29% because we lost a lot of market in the state due to the decline of the industrial sector. So power was plentiful. We didn't really need to build power plants. Well, you know, here we are 8 years later, and the market's come back significantly. So we're down, running right around our reserve margin, around 15%. And as we start to retire power plants in the future, I think you will see the utilities build generation to meet our customers' needs. So that will come. We are going to file for a new power plant with the Michigan Public Service Commission in July of this year.
Good.
About 1,000 megawatts, 1,000 to 1,200 megawatts in the Bell River area.
Now to connect the dots for members of the committee, the situation you just described about your concern with who's responsible with the 10% of the market that is supplied by alternative energy suppliers. Who's the provider of last resort? If the AES can't provide the actual capacity, who is? And in your market, you are. And I just wanted the committee to be aware that that's specifically what I was talking about in Illinois and Ohio, where they put it out to bid who wants to be the alternative or the provider of last resort. And you've actually won that competitive bid in Ohio to be the provider of last resort. We could have a similar system here where you are not required by law to be the provider of last resort, but instead it could be put out to bid. Is that correct?
I think that we have the legislation that we have, and I think that is the most effective form of regulation. You know, I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I really feel, and we feel as a company, that in Ohio and Illinois, where they've undertaken some of these mechanisms, there is in Ohio they've moved back to regulation. In New York, which was one of the first states to try deregulation, they've had to re-regulate their nuclear plants. It's just not working. And my view is that why do we want to bring something to Michigan where it's been proven elsewhere that it doesn't work? And that the state regulation seems to be the best form of regulation. I think as a state, you know, vacating from state regulation for our power generation assets, it's our opinion that that would not be the best energy policy for this state to move this state forward. I think having state control and state regulation is the most beneficial form of regulation. I think the two choices are federal regulation and state regulation. And I think when you have the chairman of the FERC who sits on top of all of these federal regulations saying it really hasn't worked, and I think the states should really think about re-regulating these markets. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement from the head bureaucrat that runs all of the federal rules and procedures that govern these federally regulated markets in Ohio, Illinois, New York. And the reason it's not working is there's, you know, one, a lot of the existing assets, these markets can't support them, the continuation of their operation, especially the nuclear assets. And next will be the coal assets, because natural gas is so cheap. And so it will create a reliability issue cannot be sustained in these states. And I think some of these states that are operating in these markets are starting to say, geez, I think we made a mistake, you know, having these assets be federally regulated with these rules, and we're slowly moving back towards state regulation. Now in Ohio, I mean, they're a bastion of leaving things alone in the way they are, but it'll be really interesting to see what happens over the next 10 years in Ohio as the coal plants shut down, perhaps the nuclear plants shut down because they can't make money. I'm not sure what they're going to do to maintain the reliability in that state.
There was a study done by Professor Gary Wolfram of Hillsdale College, which found that Michigan's rates were not only the highest in the Midwest, but that our electrical system was the least reliable. And we have one of the highest, I think in the top 5 in the nation, outages. So we're not scoring as high as I think we ought to in terms of reliability. And in defense of the committee, I think the last legislature had a duty to render its best judgment. I think this committee has a duty to act on its best judgment. And if we take the position that what was done last December, a bill 250 pages long, passed by the legislature, no single member of which had an opportunity to read the bill, and say that's the standard, then we're just up here spinning our wheels for 2 years. And I don't think people asked to be on this committee just to say whatever they did last December when I wasn't here is the end all and be all. Can you explain the process by which, as you understand that new law, the Public Service Commission will come up with a capacity charge, and what role you and Consumers Energy play in the PSCs coming up with that charge?
So the capacity charge was established as a method to backstop in the event that the AESs, the alternative energy suppliers, weren't able to point to a generation asset. In other words, they're serving about 10% of the market in Michigan. The law now requires those providers to say, show me your generating asset, just like the utilities can point to Monroe and Fermi and other power plants in the state. And if they can't do that, then the law requires that those customers of those providers pay the utilities a capacity charge such that the utilities can provide capacity for those customers so that they can have power. How is it established? Well, it's a cost of service charge. It'll be the same charge that we charge all of our customers today for generation.
Your CEO told the Senate Energy Committee about almost precisely a year ago today that he estimated the average year capacity to be about $460 a megawatt hour. How does that compare with your filing to the PSC to help them calculate the capacity charge, and how does that compare with what the capacity charge would be if we were to apply the new auction price of $1.50 per megawatt day?
Yeah, so the $460 sounds per megawatt hour sounds very high. It's probably around 46
megawatt day.
Megawatt day. Okay.
Yep.
I'm familiar with it, and I apologize for the units, but our average cost of service for our generating assets are around $160,000 per megawatt year is the convention that I'm used to, sir. So I apologize for I don't want to mix up units for you, but we can divide by 365 and get to the megawatt day calculation from that number. And I can't do the math in my head, so.
He said it was about $460 a megawatt day.
Right.
Jerry Anderson.
Yeah, so that's about, if you run the math through, it's pretty close to $160,000 per megawatt year. Now, you asked me the question, how does that compare to the $1.50 per megawatt day that came out of the MISO auction? As I mentioned before, most generators in the MISO auction have offered their assets at zero capacity. And the reason for that is they're recovering it already through their regulated rates. So it's not a true representation of what the cost of a generating asset is. There is no way that anybody could run a generating plant and have a reasonable return and pay their debt holders and pay their employees and all their operation and maintenance costs for $1.50 a megawatt day. It's just not going to happen.
And how does that $460 a megawatt day compare to what you propose to the PSC they calculate the capacity charge to be?
I think it would be pretty close to that. I don't have the exact comparison, but I do know that we do run approximately $160,000 per megawatt year, which I don't think would be far off the number that you're quoting. It's going to be very close.
And for the sake of the ratepayers, presumably the PSC and you and everybody else would agree that whatever capacity charge they come up with reflects the most efficient, least cost resource.
Absolutely. We believe our assets, since they're highly depreciated, to be the most cost-effective way to serve the state of Michigan at this point, as well as whatever assets we continue to add to support the reliability. But the Commission does a very good job of making sure that the most reasonable and prudent rates are delivered to our customers.
Thank you, Jerry. Representative Deanda, do you still have to leave? Okay, yes, I'm calling you now. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony, sir. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I guess my first question, if I may, Mr. Chair, is how much investment have you made in solar currently, and what are you looking at for the future for dollar amounts?
Our investment in solar are well over $100 million at this point in time. Our total investments in renewables, including wind, are over $2 billion at this point in time. Now, solar is more expensive than wind in this state for obvious reasons. I mean, the sun doesn't shine here as much as we would all like, I think, and wind seems to be the more economic resource when we can place it. But we continue to invest in solar because the prices are coming down. And to the extent that we continue to make those investments, I think we encourage the industry to innovate and drive costs down.
Thank you, sir. And my second question would be, what do you see to get our rates down in Michigan that your company's working forward to be able to see a reduction in our kilowatt cars for commercial and residential?
I think you've seen that we're managing our operating and maintenance costs best in class in the industry. I mean, our operating and maintenance costs are actually down since 2006, 2007 compared to the rest of the industry, which is up 35%. So we're managing our operating and maintenance costs extremely well. We're one of the few companies that can actually boast that on an absolute basis, we're actually down from where we were 10 years ago. In terms of managing capital investment, which also drives costs to our customers, we are competitively bidding all our supply chain. We are constantly working and benchmarking with other energy providers to make sure that we're using the latest technology and the most cost-efficient technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative. Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions, if I may, Mr. Chair. The first was on your, I think this is the annex packet that you gave us on slide number 2. You were kind of comparing the regulated and deregulated rates on there, and I was curious about that, and not knowing myself. I feel that a lot of the rate makeup is more or less comprised of the generation source, so the cost of the fuel and the distribution of that and how far you got to send it down the line and everything else. Would it be safe to say that, and I'm not criticizing your presentation, but that this is kind of a, I guess, a blunt instrument look at regulated versus deregulated, because in some of the regulated states you're going to have hydroelectric power providing the vast majority of power to the customer, which of course has very little fuel cost and a startup investment, but then is self-sustaining after that point. Whereas other states like Michigan, we have to import coal from further away, so our cost to generate that power is going to be higher. What percent of the rates would you suggest are made up by the fuel source and that difference that exists there between what our source of power is going to be generally more on the coal and natural gas side and less on the hydro side of some other states perhaps?
So I would say about half the cost to generate power, the generation itself, is the fuel and the rail to get the fuel to our power plants, and then the other half is the actual asset itself. Mm-hmm. Now, in terms of the total rate, about 40% of the total rate that you see in these numbers, at least for our operation, is generation, which is the fuel, the rail, and the power plant. Right. The other 60% is to get the power from the power plant to a person's home or business.
Right. Okay. And I know that we can look at regulated versus deregulated, but I think to peel back the layers, we'd have to go beyond just regulated as this, deregulated as that. If they're using a different fuel source, or if they're distributing it less distance, if they're more compacted. I mean, municipal rates tend to be less because they're, more, more closely compacted areas, so they have less distribution costs and other things of that sort. And I guess, we can all do our own research on that particular facet of it. But speaking of fuel source, I wanted to ask you about the coal makeup of your fleet. I know a lot of coal plants are older, certainly, but I assume in the case of DTE, they're probably all paid for by now. Is that accurate?
Well, we've made incremental investment in our power plants, so they're not fully depreciated. Some of our really old plants are close to being fully depreciated.
Sure.
But for example, in Monroe, where we've invested $2 billion over the last 10 years for environmental controls, there's still a significant balance on the balance sheet.
Okay. Other than Monroe, I guess, would it be safe to say they're pretty well paid down?
I would say the largest investment balances are at Monroe, Fermi, as well as Bell River, some of our younger plants. Some of our older plants, we're trying to really minimize the amount of investment since they'll likely retire mid next decade. So we're really toning down the amount. We're got to keep them safe so they can run safely. But other than that, we're making very little investment in those plants.
And how much of the desire or the intent to close down those plants is related to federal or state environmental regulation, and how much of that is the decision for other factors, perhaps of just the age of the asset?
Well, there's two reasons really that the assets are retiring. One is age. I think we've gotten to the point with a lot of these power plants. I'll give you an example. Our St. Clair Unit 4 and Rouge number 2, we had basically failures in the rotor, which is the big piece of equipment that spins the generator.
Sure.
And the plant's so old, when we did the economic analysis, it just wasn't worth repairing it. So we idled that plant, retired that plant. So age has really taken a lot of these plants offline. My worry is, will they last as long as we anticipate? So we're maintaining them, trying to maintain them to keep them running and maintain reliability. The other factor, I think you touched on it, is there's been a lot of federal regulation by the EPA, especially around water treatment, as well as SO2 regulations, sulfur dioxide, that are creating pressure for us to retire these plants. So for example, the Rouge plant, Rouge 3, is under a lot of pressure from the EPA to remove that SO2 emitting source in that region where you got U.S. Steel and us there. It's a tough area from an air pollution perspective. And this plant was built in the 50s. And there's no value in us putting any pollution control equipment on that plant, so we're likely to retire that at the turn of decade. So age kind of dictates, is it worth putting the money into them to keep them running? The answer is no. And then secondly, there's environmental controls that have to go on these plants in order for them to keep running under current regulations. And so both those forces are driving us to retire some of these plants.
Okay. I just, if I may, Mr. Chair, continue. I just took a tour of the Board of Water and Light here in the Lansing area. I represent a district that has a large number of customers that are on the Board of Water and Light through Lansing as their service provider, and they have the Erickson plant in my district. I just toured that on Friday, and they were sharing with me that that is a completely paid-for asset by the board. It's a coal-fired plant, and they're in the process of negotiating environmental concerns because they want to keep it as open as long as they can and as safely as possible, because it's a paid-for asset that could probably run until 2030, they shared with me. It was built sometime in the 1970s, and of course they've put progressively over time better and better environmental controls in place that are very, very firmly regulated, but they don't want to have to pull that asset offline prematurely. Now, obviously there's a federal regulation that's in place for air quality and other polluting concerns, but then there's also the desire to have an asset that's paid for that customers can certainly benefit from. I guess with the new administration coming in and some of the executive orders and other directions that the Trump administration is headed in, certainly favoring coal as a means of generating electricity, do you see that scaling back some of what was certainly pushed in the previous administration that almost really had a very, I don't want to say a disdain for coal, but certainly an adversarial position toward coal? And I think the change has come, and where do you see that going with the environmental side?
So I think that the new administration is going to be beneficial for younger coal plants. I really think that that'll have an impact on coal plants. For example, the rollback at a clean power plan will be helpful for some coal generators to extend the lives of those power plants and they were going to be shut down in order to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. In our case, I think it will be beneficial to plants like the Bell River power plant. It's one of our youngest plants. It was built in the mid-'80s. Monroe will continue to run because we've invested $2 billion, and no matter what regulation they're going to put out there at this point in time, I think we can comply based on the level of investment that we've made in pollution controls. I think that our older coal plants that were built in the 50s, like Trenton, the St. Clair units, those are going to be tough to keep running for a long time. I don't think they'll make the journey much beyond the mid-2020s in terms of operating safely and reliably. I think they'll expire naturally.
Okay. And then what, I guess in the next 30 years, say then, what do you expect your makeup of coal percentage-wise to be? Because I think we're roughly half coal right now. Is that kind of accurate?
We're running about 60 to 70% coal
Okay.
at DTE Energy. But that's a great question. You know, much like your 401k, having a balanced portfolio makes a ton of sense in terms of how diverse resources to generate electricity. So if we fast forward 15 or 20 years, I think what you'll see at DTE Energy is you'll see about a third coal, a third natural gas, and a third clean resources like nuclear and wind and solar. So as we build out our portfolio long term, and you'll see more of that when we file it in July as part of our new plant build, gas plant build, we'll kind of depict what the future is going to look like for our generation fleet. And I think that what you'll find is it'll be a very balanced portfolio. Coal will be in our future for a very long time.
Okay. And then one last question, Mr. Chair. He was asking about your selling of electricity into Ohio. Is that done by Michigan-based generating assets, or are those assets in Ohio that you sell with?
They are not Michigan-based assets. They're assets that we procure in Ohio and other areas of PJM.
Okay, so the generating source is out of state as well. No Michigan generators are providing power across the border?
That's correct. I'll make sure that that's correct, but I am 90% certain.
Other than I'm
correct.
sure
Yeah.
you know, stray electron may flow over the grid. And
Well, the reality is last summer we
don't
were
have a border wall.
last year we were importing electricity into the state. So we're fortunate that the region outside of MISO Zone 7, which is Michigan, has excess capacity. But I think as that excess capacity dries up, our ability to import into Michigan is going to dry up as well.
Okay. And I heard somewhere that Michigan, 80% of the time we are exporting energy and 20% we're importing. That was a number that was thrown out to me a while back, that when we're actually importing energy, it's during the low peak times we're importing wind energy from, you know, wind producing states, you know, and our generators are, you know, our gas generators are turned off and other things like that. Is that inaccurate, would you say?
I'm not aware of those figures.
Okay.
I can check on that.
I can't remember who told me that.
What I do know
Might have
is
been a fake news site.
what I do know is that last year, on the hottest day of the year, our import capacity, how much we were bringing into the state, was maxed out.
Okay.
And we were at the point where we were preparing to interrupt our industrial customers that buy interruptible service from us. So that was pretty tough. What changed that day was that a thunderstorm rolled through and lowered the temperature by about 10 degrees. Otherwise, we would have had to interrupt our industrial customers that buy interruptible service, so they know that they have the potential to be interrupted. So we are, in terms of reserve margin, I really believe we are operating at very thin margins at or just below the required reserve margin. So thus the need for us to invest in more generation in the state.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Jerry, you comported yourself well under the additional pressure of questioning from the guy from Gitmo.
Thank you, sir.
On slide 4, you indicate that your rate is half a penny cheaper than the average in Michigan?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you're in the competitive catbird seat if there were no market service areas. Michigan ratepayers, industrial users especially, would benefit if they could buy from DTE no matter where they're located in Michigan. Is that something we should consider in the future, to allow a major industrial user to buy from DTE even if they're in consumers market area and vice versa?
Well, if we were to get all the load from all industrial users in the state of Michigan, we'd have to build a lot more generation.
But you make money when you do that, right?
We do, but I would venture to say that our cost to produce, because it'd be all new generating plants, would be more expensive than some of the depreciated plants that exist today in Michigan that serve that load in consumers' territory and other service providers' territory. So I'm not sure that would be helpful to this market. I mean, you'd have a bunch of excess generation sitting around, and it would probably have to be mandated, because I don't think it'd be a competitive process that we'd be able to outcompete our neighbors with new generation.
Okay. If Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. So one of the things that's interesting to me is this idea about, and thank you for spending some time on it, the different regulatory models, so where you have federal and you have state regulated markets. When we're looking at that, one of the things as I've been looking across the different competitors is the value that's placed on carbon. So in a competitive market, there's no value placed on carbon. And carbon emissions. And so when we've had our municipal boards, as Representative Barrett pointed out to us, Lansing Board and Power and Light came to testify in front of us, our munis, our conservative energy forums, we're hearing that across the state that our residents do place a value on renewable energy and on energy efficiency. And we don't see those as factors in determination of a generation portfolio if it's strictly based on lowest cost. So taking that kind of picture in mind of what the ratepayers are expressing that they want. They're expressing in terms of the municipals, the Lansing Board and Light who came to testify, and the other municipals, that their ratepayers, as they ranked cost per kilowatt hour, clean air, that they were willing to, they ranked clean power production higher than the cost per kilowatt hour, indicating a willingness to pay a little bit more if it was a clean power generation source. How do you see that playing into Illinois looking to move towards more regulation in order to leave the nuclear power plants online, which are low emitters, as opposed to looking for a simple calculation of the lowest cost per kilowatt hour, which could be coming from gas or coal, which has different environmental implications?
So I think, Representative Vice Chair, you've stated it very correctly that there is a desire by our customers to have more renewable resources in our portfolio, and they elect representatives to the legislature that advocate for those policies. So I think in this state what has happened is there is a representation of the people's desire to have more renewables in the generation fleet, and it may not necessarily be the lowest cost option. The costs have come way down, but if we model out into the future, and if we're eliminating baseload, the most economic thing to do is to replace it with baseload. But if there is a desire by elected officials and by regulators and by society in general to move to cleaner sources of energy, which we support as a company, then I think renewables have to be part of the mix. There will be a modest premium to having renewables in the portfolio, which I think we've seen, but we support that policy.
And did you see that playing into the Illinois subsidization of their nuclear power plants at this point? That if it was more cost efficient to simply take them offline for the ratepayer, why are they choosing to subsidize their nuclear plants?
So I think there was two reasons that the legislature moved in Illinois. One was just necessity, need and necessity for the asset. If they removed all the nuclear generation in Illinois, that would not be a cost-effective move, because someone would have to replace that generator. Well, first of all, you'd have a big problem with power reliability because it's a very large nuclear fleet that operates inside Illinois. So I think the legislature is looking and saying, oh my God, if these assets get retired, how are we going to have reliable power for our industry and for our customers in Illinois? So I think it was good state policy to say we need to support these assets with state regulation in order to make sure that they survive, first of all. So survival of the asset was job number one. Job number two is the fact that if you retire the nuclear plants, they're going to be replaced with carbon plants, either coal or natural gas. Now, natural gas is clean, but it's not as clean as nuclear from an emissions perspective. So I think those were the two primary reasons. One was just need and necessity to serve customers, and two, to preserve a clean resource. And in New York, the Gina plant, nuclear plant, they came up with a very, very creative way. The state stepped in to save the Gina plant because Entergy was going to shut it down, and they created a zero emissions credit, another manipulation of the market, another regulatory requirement that now the state introduced to keep that plant alive. And the reason for that was reliability, because it was on the west side of the state in the Rochester area, and that grid needed that nuclear plant to kind of keep that grid reliable. And they also were looking to have a low emitting resource in the state.
Can I follow up with a?
Sure.
So following up, so we've talked about the carbon, but now talking about that stability and grid reliability. When we're looking at the provider of last resort and when we're looking at capacity charge, I believe we had a 3 or 5 year auction that was determined to be not sufficient by MISO. When you're looking at the length of these assets and you're asking someone who's coming in to supply power to auction out 3 to 5 years of capacity to prove that they can provide into the grid, does that seem an appropriate time frame window to you, looking at the length of durable baseload assets?
Well, when we make an investment in a generating plant, it lives for 30 to 40 years. So to have a 3 or 4 year capacity commitment on an asset that lives 30 to 40 years is to make an investment against that is a very difficult business decision to make, and usually not a wise decision. When I look at our competitive businesses like the pipeline business, when we build pipelines, we sign 15-year contracts, 15 to 20-year contracts to make sure that that pipeline is viable into the future for our investors and for our customers. So a 4-year contract is insufficient. Now the reality is, in our current law here in Michigan that just got passed, that provision is in there that they must provide for 4 years, provide us with 4 years of commitment. And if they walk away from that contract at the end of 4 years, then all that cost now reverts to the customers that are bundled at DTE. So it's again a cross subsidy of capacity of a capacity build or a generating plant build.
And final question, when we're looking then at balancing those generation and capacity loads and how we do that, there's this idea of, as you were speaking of, the peak hot day. That hot day that then we have to add the 15% reserve to, which forces us to have, in essence, about a 30% excess generation over an average day. Energy efficiency is one of the easiest ways to shave that peak. How does energy efficiency play into a regulated, a state regulated versus a federally regulated market? The encouragement of trying to shave that peak so we don't need as much generation capacity, which lowers a ratepayer's cost per kilowatt hour.
Well, I think the best example I can give you is what's happened in our market. So, for example, the state mandated energy efficiency initiatives. The best way not to build a power plant is not to have the need for the power. And so if I look at our lighting load, for example, just use a real simple example, it's about 25% of our total load. When you install LED lights, you remove about 80 to 90% of that load from lighting. So it's a significant reduction in usage. And the state mandated energy efficiency initiatives that really went after the promotion of LED lights. And we've been surprised how quick the adoption has been. And what it's done is it's flattened out our load growth. We're adding about 0.5% in terms of customer count every year, but our load is growing at 0%. And if you project that out about 10 or 15 years, it actually eliminated the need for a new power plant. So for about $1 billion investment. So it can be significant. And that's just one example, which is lighting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Lisinski. Representative Lauer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On this question of renewable resources, does your company offer some kind of program where people can voluntarily pay a higher rate to draw their resources from renewable? I think some companies do that. I was just curious about that program.
Yes, we do. We offer a voluntary renewable program where customers can sign up for a greater proportion of renewables in our portfolio. So, for example, our renewable portfolio right now is about 10% of our energy is generated from renewables, so everybody gets 10%, right? But if you want that proportion to be higher, then you have the opportunity to pay for the premium to have more renewables
that
in your
kind of
portfolio.
goes to your remarks earlier about people supposedly wanting, to come from renewables so they can already voluntarily opt to put their, basically put their money into that.
Exactly.
Voluntarily. Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Going way back to the earlier in the presentation on the question of variable versus fixed cost, I think Representative Barrett asked you the question on what proportion that was. Is it 50-50, did you say, fixed and variable?
That's correct. That's approximate, yes.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. So being that's the case, you're charging a variable rate to cover both fixed and variable costs. So you're saying that causes this difference in our rates in Michigan being higher than in Ohio because while our total bill is, according to your data, less, but the rate's actually higher because of the fixed cost. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, so if I can take you to slide 6 in the appendix. I think this might help maybe bring some clarity, I hope, to this question. So if you look at residential use, what this chart is, residential use, kilowatt hours per customer. So you got the usage on the left axis, and then you got years on the horizontal axis. And what you can see is that customers in Ohio, let's start with Michigan, use about roughly 8,000 kilowatt hours per customer. In Ohio, they're using about 11,000 kilowatt hours per customer. So they're putting about 40% more through their wires than we are. Okay. Now those wires cost the same. Those poles cost the same. The wires and the poles don't change based on how much electricity, that you're putting 30 or 40% more electricity through them on average. So what that means is that the rates in Ohio, because of that, are lower. So if you take your costs, your variable costs and your fixed costs, and you divide it by the usage, you end up with a lower rate. Now the bills in Ohio, if you go to slide, so the rates will be lower in Ohio than they will be in Michigan for residential customers. Now if you go to the bills, what you'll see is that Michigan's bills are lower than those in Ohio. You say, well, what's going on? Well, it's because they put less juice through the wires. We put less juice through the wires. So our rates are higher, but our total bill, the bill that the customer sees and pays every month, the cash out of their pocket, is actually lower than those in Ohio. And that's because in Ohio, they just use that much more electricity. It's much hotter, so there's a much higher air conditioning load. So for example, in Indiana, which has got a similar phenomenon, and it's a regulated state, they use about 70% more electricity than Michigan because the air conditioning load is that much higher as you move into the as you move further south. So that's the phenomenon that's driving the difference between bills and rates. And it's a hard one. I know that Chairman Glenn and I spent a little bit of time talking about this. It could be valuable at some time if you were all interested to provide a little tutorial on how rates are established and how our rates turn into bills and what creates the difference. But the difference is fundamentally weather is one that creates a difference in rates, and then two is the access to coal and natural gas and the distance that you are from that resource.
Okay, good explanation there. The other question I had on that then is on the fixed cost, you're saying it's the same. So in Ohio, a power pole in Ohio
Correct.
is the same as in
Power
Michigan?
plants.
Power
Yep.
plant. Okay.
Very similar in cost.
Representative Riley.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the question and answer session here, the marathon
you.
session. I just had a question about the amount of employees that you have at DTE. Do you have any data on, first off, that shows us what that looks like? And the reason I asked that is you said something that kind of made me curious, and that was that you said you do not lay off employees. And with industry the way it is, and technology, our friend, usually allows us to decrease the amount of people we have working for us.
Correct.
Especially when you mentioned that the decrease in employees at some of the gas-fired plants. So how can you, through attrition, do that balancing act when you come as you come about plants where you have substantially less employees that are needed?
So we've got in total we have 10,000 employees at DTE Energy, and many thousands of contractors that work on our property every day. So because of the age of our workforce, our average age is somewhere between 45 and 47. That over the next 10 years, we expect that 40 to 50% of our workforce will retire. And as that workforce retires, and they also, not only will they retire, but many employees leave for other opportunities. Some employees leave for other opportunities. Based on that attrition level, we've studied this very carefully at our power plants because our most valuable resource is our people. And what we want to do is make sure that we maintain the compact we have with our employees, which is quite special in terms of how engaged they are and how safe they are and the way they do their work. We don't want to disrupt that relationship with our employees, so we've modeled the retirement rate inside the power plants, and what we found was for all the different trades that work there, like electricians, power plant operators, senior power plant operators, millwrights, fuel handling specialists, the list goes on. We're finding that over the next 7 to 8 years, there's enough retirement there. Actually, the retirement rate exceeds our need rate, so we're actually going to have to hire some contract employees, temporary employees, to fill in the gaps when we model that. So there will be no need to lay off employees. because of the power plant conversions from coal to natural gas.
So you would say that this has been going on for the last 5 years, that you've had a significant reduction in employees through attrition then, or is that?
We have attrition every year. We lose anywhere between 3 to 5% of our employee base every year due to retirements, or they leave the company for other reasons.
And it just so happens that coincides with the amount of employees that you need. So I'm just thinking, if you're putting gas plants in right now and you're reducing employees, I mean, I'm just, by chance, it just happens to even out just right? Or
It doesn't even out exactly right, Representative. So what will happen is some trades will attrition faster. So we will have a gap in need. In other words, we'll have less employees than we actually need. And what we'll do is we'll complement that employee base with contract employees that will be temporary employees. In areas where we'll have more employees than we need at the end of the horizon, which we don't see much of that happening because the retirement rates are significant, that we would redeploy those people to other parts of the business units. But that doesn't seem to be a big deal for us right now. The bigger deal is I think we're going to have less employees than we actually need when we retire these plants. So we're actually, in the intervening period, going to have to complement that with contract employees.
Okay, thank you.
Jerry, one last question. Capacity charge is intended to compensate you for the customers of any AES that was to walk away from their contract. If the PSC does develop a capacity charge, is there any justification thereafter for continuing to have a 10% cap on the amount of electricity generated in Michigan that can be sold through the choice market and bought from somebody other than DTE and consumers?
So the answer to do we need to continue to have a capacity charge or need to continue to have a cap on choice, the answer we believe is yes, and I'll take a minute to explain why. When we arrived at the capacity charge in the last legislative process, it was really determined to be a last resort type charge. In other words, if the AESs could not furnish capacity or furnish generating assets, then these customers would come back to DTE and consumers for service. Now the reality is, if all 10% were to show up at once, we'd have a really hard time finding the generating assets to serve those customers because they don't exist. We'll take on as many as we can. So if we were to so that's why I got limited to 10% because it's a last resort charge. If we open this thing wide open and we start getting more customers coming back, there is no way we can build the assets fast enough to service those customers. So it would create a huge reliability issue for the state.
How were they served from 2008 when everybody was free to choose?
Well, there's a huge overcapacity in the market, as I mentioned earlier. The reserve margins were in the 20s. So a lot of these AESs, the reason they came to Michigan is because they saw a low-price capacity market and an opportunity to buy cheap power and mark it up. Now, the power was being produced by us, so they're buying it from us, marking it up and making a profit. They don't own any assets. They don't have assets in Michigan that are required to generate electricity. So now as that's drying up, the reserve margin's drying up, I think we're all going to be strapped to find a home for that load.
Jerry, thanks so much for your very informative testimony here this morning. We will excuse Representative Keevala and Representative Garrett, and this committee will stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.